A little girl, she must have been 3 years old, stood on the corner of a street in Brooklyn and cheered a small processional band that played to her ears a cheery tune as they led a vehicle by her house. The vehicle carried white boxes she could see through the slats of the truck. For some reason, no one knows why, she was allowed to leave her quarantined apartment and go out to the sidewalk and watch the procession. She remembers she danced like you see a 3-year-old dance, with abandon, lacking any discernible pattern, while her brother, who was 8 and wasn't allowed outdoors, leaned out the window of their apartment and shook his fist at her. She probably couldn't hear him yelling at her to get inside and show some respect for the dead. So she kept on her celebration, an ironic show of life in the face of death in those boxes, who were being given the best funeral procession the city of New York could muster in the year 1918. The city was gripped by the Spanish flu, the world in the Spanish flu's teeth, and the few who were allowed out danced as the New York funerals paraded through the streets. In the Northeast, cemeteries struggled to handle the soaring death toll. Gravediggers were absent, either because they had contracted the flu or they had feared getting the flu. Grieving families were forced to excavate tombs for their loved ones. In New Brunswick, New Jersey, 15 workhouse inmates were handed spades and picks to dig graves under the watchful eye of guards. In Baltimore, city employees were called into emergency duty as gravediggers, while soldiers from Fort Meade were pressed into service to bury a 3-week backlog of 175 bodies at Mount Auburn Cemetery. Entire neighborhoods in the Northeast were draped in black crepe on front doors to mark the death inside. Funeral homes stacked coffins in hallways and living spaces. The boy, whose father ran the funeral home on the corner down the street from the dancing girl in the Brooklyn neighborhood, invited his friends to come and climb what he called the pyramids. But no one showed up because their parents knew better to keep their children inside. The girl danced, and the funeral processions kept coming, and her brother, who shook his fist, watched as the Jewish doctor from upstairs came down to examine the Italian immigrant families in the tenement building. And I imagine that some combination of that doctor coming in to tell them how to stay safe from the deadly influenza and those caskets going by on the street and his protective anger over his dancing sister and his intelligence, in there a thought occurred to him that he could help and become a doctor. 5 years later, at age 13, this boy, the shaking fist boy in the window, was enrolled in college. 4 years after that, in med school. And by age 21, he was a practicing physician in a tuberculosis hospital in New Jersey, dealing with another kind of pandemic in the 30s and the 40s. And when the war came and every able-bodied man went because they were called or they volunteered, this man didn't go because while swimming in the East River as a boy, he was either kicked by accident or on purpose, rupturing his eye. He was left home to practice medicine. And over the years, this neighborhood doctor saw many things, including mobsters show up at his door after a shootout that he sent away, knowing no favor goes unpunished by organized crime. He saw Legionnaire's disease hit. He saw cases of lung disease that he diagnosed as varieties of Legionnaires, but not Legionnaires, and saved many lives because they were different. He grew his practice and served his Italian immigrants, patients who were like his parents, so poor that they could only pay him in jugs of homemade wine and canned tomatoes and pizzas. They cooked and brought them to the back door of the kitchen attached to the office. And he saw soldiers come back from 3 wars and drug use grow through the 70s in America and the devastation of AIDS, and he led a local hospital and worked on ethics panel and ran his practice and always questioned easy answers and always thought of what greater good there was in each decision he made, however difficult they were. And he would have been a fan of Neil deGrasse Tyson, who says, "Think for yourself. Question yourself. Don't believe anything just because you want to believe it. Believing something doesn't make it so." And he would have wondered at leadership that tried to sway the public to get back to work in the middle of a pandemic. And he probably voted Republican in every election, and he was in some way supportive of moderate conservative agendas, but he would have been shaking his fist from the window if he saw the leader of the free world pushing an untested drug as a solution to a disease no one knows enough about. And he would have lost his mind if the President of the United States dared to interject the idea of injecting disinfectant as a solution to a disease he knows nothing about, even if it was a joke, and it wasn't. Imagine the staff around the president, those scientists who have spent their whole careers studying the replication of viruses and the activity of the endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi bodies, who then had to waste their time to explain to the world that you shouldn't inject disinfectant. The doctor who started out as a boy watching caskets being paraded down the streets of New York during a pandemic which took thousands of lives always sought ways for the world around him to understand the importance of making scientific choices and making them for the good of all. The reason I'm telling you this story and the reason I know all this is because that boy in the window who turned into a doctor and a questioner of easy answers was my grandfather. I know the stories very possibly exaggerated because they're from my family, let's face it, but I know them because that dancing girl who went out to hear the music is my aunt, who is 105 years old and remembers every minute of the last pandemic and is still alive as one of the few who knew the Spanish flu and COVID-19. She remembers the dancing and the fist shaking, but not the details of the problems they dealt with. She reminded me, while I think of my grandfather often during this pandemic, that he would have asked whether we were in this together or not. When we think back on those who have seen a lot and lived through things like this before, we need to know that we too can survive this. A little patience goes a long way. We are all sick of this problem. But some people are really sick of it. And some are dying, and we owe it to everyone to stay the course and not follow our desires back to what we think should be normal. What we know is we aren't going to go back to normal life. We will be going back to modified life. We will be making modifications for a year or more. And that is going to take some spiritual strength, the kind that those who have persevered through more than this had to do before us. We are going to have to tune out those who are not in this with us. You see, I keep hearing this statement that we're all in this together, and in a very general and loving way, I think we are, because no one gets out of this without some sacrifice. And in some ways, not a single person in the world is exempt from this moment. But we also aren't all in this together. As working people suffer and see costs go up and income down, and headlines tell us that billionaires in the world have increased their wealth by 10% since mid-March, while 30 million Americans have filed unemployment, we have to ask, are we all in this together? And maybe if we were all in this together, instead of discussing the last stupid thing the president has done, we'd be discussing how to recalibrate our economy to support the people who are putting their lives on the line so the rest of us can shelter from this storm. Not just for today, but for all days. Truckers and delivery people and doctors and nurses and sanitation workers and clerks and orderlies and firefighters and police and utility workers and cashiers at supermarkets, among others, but not how to help billionaires. If we were in this together, we wouldn't be talking about sacrificing lives for the economy. We'd be asking questions about how to create a new economy that is built not on a system of inequality or prop up poisonous politics, but is built on something deeper and more loving. We'd be asking questions of our leaders about not when we can get back to normal, but will they make the change in their policies that will honor the dignity of work and give voice to those who are at risk? If we were in this together, we wouldn't allow our governors to advance the pandemic as a political wedge that divides and conquers Americans over things like liberty and freedoms. Attempts to make the virus a party issue is a deadly proposition. I heard recently that party affiliation in the U.S. is directly correlated to believing in the virulence of COVID-19, with the extremes on the political affiliation line, on the right dismissing it altogether, and on the left claiming it a conspiracy. In the center, the arguments are, on the right, how many people should die to get the economy going, and on the left, how safely to return, even if sacrificing more jobs and businesses is part of that. All of that's important. There is real pain on all sides of this. But that is not a we are all in this together kind of thought. The virus as a political wedge is manifest when people parade in front of state houses demanding we get back to normal and open up and rush back into life as it was. Darwin Awards might be given out for such activity. If you don't know what Darwin Awards are, look them up. But those protests in the name of freedom are political statements, and they are misguided. The Dallas Morning News editors put it plainly last week in their opinion page, saying coronavirus protesters have forgotten something important about their rights, that, as Roman Cicero put it, our obligation as free people includes the obligation to consider how we are bound together in a life of shared responsibility, which are inseparable from our individual rights. It is true that the fear of losing our livelihoods is real. But the fear of losing individual liberty is misguided when it forgets a service to the larger whole. So we need to ponder this, friends. To place the greater good above ourselves is the task of today. In all ways and in all aspects of life, in all work and families and communities, we have to ask this question so that we don't dance on the corner while others have to stay inside. We have to recalibrate our lives so we serve one another. And that might mean sacrificing things and time and what we think life should be so the spread of this virus isn't given another chance among us. This week I signed a letter with my multi-faith colleagues to the governor of Texas urging him not to rush to open faith communities. As difficult as that is for me to say while I'm preaching in an empty church to you through a camera lens and praying you will return and we'll figure out how to be a community together, I do not confuse liberty with sacrifice. The letter states, in affirming the loving role of faith communities in slowing the spread of the virus, we reject the claim that continued closure is somehow an insult to religious faith and freedom. Our faith leads us to compassionate concern for all members of society, and we know that staying closed saves lives. Our faith leads us to act of sacrifice, including the temporary sacrifice of familiar modes and places of prayer in order to contribute to public health and to the public good. Our faith warns us about idols, including the idols that even our physical houses of worship can become. Our buildings may be closed, but the hearts of the faithful continue to open in prayer, in song, in study, in acts of compassion, and the urge to justice. You see, I learned all this in my family. To know small extent from my grandfather. That we do what is right, and we do it with resolve, and we always do it for others. Are we in this together? In a sense, yes. In a sense, no. But unless we, as Unitarian Universalists, put our faith to work and help others understand how our interdependence supersedes everything else, we will fail each other. And the story will always be that this time we weren't for each other. A failure of faith, failure of community, failure to be together in this. We can do it. We can, like the boy in the pandemic who realized he could devote his life to others' health and well-being, make a difference with who we are and what we do, even when it challenges our inner urge to be free and to do what we want. We can tap that higher calling within that says we can see beyond this moment to a view of the world together again, but it'll take some continued sacrifice, something that faith has emphasized for centuries, something that we are still learning. So, friends, I want to close with a poem, an encouragement to you. A poem written by Kitty O'Meara. I've read it many times on staff meetings and to others. It was written at the beginning of the outbreak. The poem suggests that perhaps something other than darkness can come from this isolation. And I join her in her urge for hope, knowing that we can be in this together if we put ourselves forward, if we do what is right. She wrote this. And the people stayed home and read books and listened and rested and exercised and made art and played games and learned new ways of being and were still and listened more deeply. Some meditated, some prayed, some danced. Some met their shadows, and the people began to think differently, and the people healed. And in the absence of people living in ignorant, dangerous, mindless, and heartless ways, the earth began to heal. And when the danger passed, and the people joined together again, they grieved their losses. They made new choices and dreamed new images and created new ways to live and heal the earth fully, as they themselves had been healed. We will live into this vision with some spiritual patience, with some deeper love for all humanity, with some hope for our returning to the world we want to live in. And there will be a day where we will dance in the corner, not for death, but for life. And we will make new decisions about our lives, like we do each day, like we ask ourselves, are we in this together? Friends, we can't see you, we can't hear you, but we love you. Remember to engage on our webpage. Join us in conversations. Join the church. Make a donation. Be part of this movement to heal the world. As I say each Sunday, I say to you today, in whatever way makes sense to you, go in peace. Walk softly on your path, and may God shine in you all the days of your life. Amen.